This is a short introductory video on the react-abac library. The react-abac library allows you to implement attribute-based access control and role-based access control in React applications. This is useful for restricting certain sections of your application based on user roles or permissions. To get started, create a new React app using create React app or open an existing React app. I've just created a new React app using create React app and installed the react-abac library using npm install react-abac. So let's take a look at our application to verify it's working. So this is just a standard create React app. Let's get started by removing some of the boilerplate. So we have an empty page now and wrapping most of our application with an ABAC provider. This is a component provided by the react-abac library. It ensures that the components down the tree have access to the logged in user and the permission rules. We'll have to provide a few props to this component, such as the permission rules, the logged in user, the roles this user has, and the permissions this user has. Note that the roles and permissions and even the user are optional, and typically you'd only pass the user and the roles. So let's get started by implementing this. We'll start by defining some roles. We'll have an admin role and a regular user role. Now let's define some rules, so permission rules. Typically, rules are described by attaching them to a role, so we'll add some permissions to the admin role here. So the admin role has, well, we don't have any permissions yet. Let's first make some permissions. So permissions, we'll have edit post. And here we'll say that the admin role has the edit post permission. This is an RBAC rule because it doesn't use any attributes but the role. It just says the user, if the user has the admin role, then it's allowed to edit posts. For regular users, we might want to restrict editing posts to posts that are owned by them. So this can be done using an ABAC rule, which we'll implement now. So yeah, instead of just saying true here, which would always allow editing posts, we can create a function which makes it an ABAC rule. The first argument is some contextual data about this permission check, which in our case will be the post. Typically this is the resource. And the second argument will be the logged in user. The return value is a boolean indicating whether permission is granted or not. So we want to grant permission if the post owner is the user. We can already pass some of this to the ABAC provider. So we have rules, and we have, well, we don't have a user yet. We need to create a user. Okay. Typically, you'd get the user from from a server somewhere. In this example, we'll just hard code a user. So this will be user with ID 1, and it'll have the admin role. So we can pass that. Then we need to pass the roles, which is just the roles of the logged in user, which we can get by accessing user.roles in our example. Now that the ABAC provider is set up, we can actually start restricting some sections of the application. So this can be achieved by using the allowed to component. It is passed a perform prop, which is either a single permission or a list of permissions. If you pass a list of permissions, then all permissions are required. If you pass one, then obviously only the one is required. In this case, we only need to pass one, namely the edit post permission. Inside here, we'll say something like you are allowed to edit the post, exclamation point. Right. Let's also create some mock post that we're editing. So post with ID 1, and its owner is also ID 1, so it's owned by user with ID 1, which is our user. And let's pass that as data to the allowed to component. Passing it as data here will make sure that your ABAC rules will receive it as the first argument. Let's see what we get when we render this. So we just get a message saying you're allowed to edit this post, which makes sense because we're an admin user and we said that admin users can always edit any post. So what happens now if we change our role from admin to user? We're still allowed to edit this post because the post has owner ID 1 and we are user with ID 1. Now what happens if we change the owner of the post to user with ID 2? We don't see anything, which is what we expect. If you want to show a message to the user saying they don't have access, you can provide a no prop to the allowed to component and render some message telling the user they don't have access. So now we're getting this. And if we change back the owner to user with ID 1, we see we're allowed to edit this post. Another way to achieve this without the allowed to component is to use the use-abac hook. So let's create a new component and use this hook. So use-abac. We'll get one function we can call from it. User has permissions, where we can evaluate whether a user has certain permissions. As the second argument, as the first argument, we pass the permissions. As the second argument, we pass the data that should be passed to ABAC rules. So this first argument here. So the data will be the post again. And the permission we want to check is the edit post permission. So here we're saying if the user doesn't have the edit post permission, then we'll return some div with not allowed, a lot of exclamation points. And if permission is allowed, we'll return a div saying yes. Let's render this component instead of the allowed to component and see what happens. So here we see yes, which makes sense because our user has ID 1 and the owner of the post is a user with ID 1. Now if we change that to 2, we'll see that we'll get not allowed, which also makes sense. If we change the role to admin, then we'll see yes because admins are always allowed access. So this all works. Now, say you want to have permissions directly on the user, so by passing a role. This is possible as well. We can define some permissions directly on the user. So we'll say edit post, and we'll just remove all roles. And we have to pass these permissions to the ABAC provider. So permissions, user.permissions. Okay, so let's see what happens. We'll get yes. Even though we don't have any roles and we're not even the owner of this post, which might not be what you want. You might still want to check whether the post is owned by the user, even if it has this permission. So this can be done by adding a rule. And instead of adding a rule inside of the map of rules for a role, you add the permission directly on the rules, and you can create an ABAC rule by implementing a function like the one above. So actually, I'll just copy paste this because we want the same security check. So here, this will make sure that if a user directly has the edit post permission, then it'll use this function to evaluate whether actual permission is granted. So let's check what happens now. We'll get not allowed, which makes sense because the post is owned by user with ID 2 and our user has ID 1. So let's set this to 1. We'll see that we get yes. So what if we set this to 2? We have the edit post permission, but we're also an admin. And we'll get yes, because only one of the permission checks has to succeed. Yeah. I think that covers the most basic use cases, maybe all. I hope this helps you get started, and good luck.